Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Division 15 Policy Committee Workshop Series. We're really happy to have you here. My name is Christine Calderon-Briesma, and I'm a member of the Division 15 Policy Committee. I'm going to help to facilitate today's session along with Dr. Benjamin Brock, who is the chair of our committee. So as the Division 15 Policy Committee, we're guided by three main goals. Our first goal as a committee is to promote collaborations between educational psychologists and stakeholders to generate ed-psych knowledge that's relevant for policy. Our second goal is to promote actions that help to facilitate stakeholders' exposure, learning, and motivation to apply ed-psych to policy. And our third goal is to support the development of educational psychologists' motivation, knowledge, and skills for contributing to policy. Every year, the Division 15 Policy Committee helps to disseminate educationally relevant policy briefs. We sponsor grants focused on ed policy. And this year, we're trying something new with our workshop series, which is why you are all here today. And so as you likely know, this workshop series will include 3 sessions. We hope that you can attend all 3, but of course, if that's not possible, we welcome you to join the ones that you can. So today we're very excited to begin our series with a panel of 3 experts. And so we're joined today by Dr. Dorothy Esplich, Dr. Lieny Jeon, and Dr. Sharon Nichols. And so I'm going to go through and tell you a little bit about each of our panelists. So Dr. Dorothy Esplich is the William C. Friday Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Espelige's research focuses on translating empirical findings into prevention and intervention programming in K-12 settings to address violence and promote student well-being. She has secured over $12 million of external funding. She advises members of Congress and Senate on bully prevention legislation. Dr. Esplich conducts regular webinars for CDC, NIH, and NIJ to disseminate research. Thank you, Dr. Esplich, for joining us today. Dr. Lieny Jeon is the Jane Batten Bicentennial Associate Professor of Early Childhood Education at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. She's also the Director of Early Childhood Initiatives at the Baltimore Education Research Consortium housed within Johns Hopkins University, leading the Baltimore City's Early Childhood Data Collaborative. Her research focuses on early care and education, family characteristics, and neighborhood disadvantage that impact children's lives. She is passionate about early childhood educators' social and emotional well-being and workforce development, and the way that it impacts young children's development. Dr. Jeon also examines how early care and education buffers challenging home and neighborhood environments and maximizes children's development. Her research has been published in national and international peer-reviewed journals and featured in the New York Times. Thank you, Dr. Jeon. Dr. Sharon Nichols is professor and chair of the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She teaches graduate and undergraduate classes in learning theory, motivation, development, and research methods, and she's authored over 36 books, journal articles, and book chapters related to youth development, motivation, and education policy. She is the co-author of Collateral Damage: How High Stakes Testing Corrupts America's Schools. Her current work focuses on the impact of test-based accountability on teachers, their instructional practices, and adolescent motivation and development. Dr. Nichols is the past vice president of Division 15 and inaugural co-editor of the new Division 15 journal, Educational Psychology for Policy and Practice. Thank you, Dr. Nichols, for coming as well. So today we're going to hear from all 3 scholars about how they engage with and incorporate policy in their work. And then later today, we'll have a breakout session where we can meet colleagues who have similar research interests and work to apply some of the information that we've learned today. So there will be time to ask questions of our panelists. And so you're welcome to wait until that Q&A portion, and then you can use the raised hand function if you want to ask your questions over voice. Of course, if you prefer to type your questions rather than to use voice, you can type your questions using the webinar Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And so with that, I'm going to turn the session over to Ben.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our panelists for your support and guidance throughout this webinar. So what are we going to be doing today? What are our goals for the workshop? We're going to engage with expert educational policy scholars to learn about how and why they got involved with research related to educational policy. We're going to establish a space for scholars to meet colleagues who share similar research interests and who want to get involved with educational policy research. And finally, we're going to create a working community of educational policy scholars. And so now we're going to go into the panel Q&A. And as Christine pointed out, and just a reminder, there will be time for audience questions. So please, start brainstorming and constructing your questions. And then when the time comes, again, please use the raise hand function, or you can enter your question into the chat, and we'll do our best to make sure to get to everyone's question in a timely manner. So with that, I'm going to start with the question portion for our panelists. I'm not going to call on anyone, just whoever would like to go first, and then we'll go from there. So the first question to our panelists is, what motivated you to begin focusing on or connecting your research to educational policy?
So so grateful that you invited me to do this panel, because it then makes me think about how did I get into educational policy. I wasn't trained to do this in graduate school. I think there was maybe an ed policy class that I had to take, but I think it was just required at Indiana University, but didn't really think about how my research would connect with that. But that changed pretty quickly, and I'm going to date myself pretty fast too. But in the mid-90s, I was a graduate student at Indiana University. And at that point, I studied eating disorders. And one reason I studied that is because we had a president at the time that had a daughter that that was an issue that she had. And so that it showed up in policy, it showed up in federal funding, but I didn't connect the two. But then I started doing work on bullying. And when I started looking at the literature on bullying in '93, there were 2 papers written in the United States, and I had to look at all the international scholars, and we had all these countries that had policies in place that defined bullying, that had bullying prevention programs. And so instantly I was thrown into this, how is there not policies for bullying? But at that point, we didn't have enough research base to say, what should that policy look like? At that point in the mid-90s, there was one state that even mentioned bullying prevention in their legislation. Fast forward now, again, dating myself 27 years later, although we're going backwards in some ways, but that's another webinar. It is very, very clear that everything we do in my lab, policy comes first. It's actually very interesting, right? So we don't engage in research questions without what are the policy implications for that? And that's how I'm attempting to train my students and my colleagues to think that way, as opposed to it just being a dissemination plan that you put together so that your funders are happy, but really thinking about using that social justice framework. So for me, it was serendipitous, it was accidental. And then when I was in that space, I was like, this is kind of cool that you could take a research article and put a one-pager together or do a congressional briefing and then see law or legislation come from that research.
Thank you so much. Dr. Nichols or Dr. Jeon?
Yeah, I can go next because I have pretty similar story here, but my story starts in 2008. I was a doctoral student at the Ohio State University, and I was involved in policy evaluation work because my advisor was doing that work. But the interesting thing was that I was very interested in parental depressive symptoms and how it is related to home environment, home learning environment, and student social emotional development. Then my advisor's work was related to early childhood education. Then when I was looking at my interest in her work, I was thinking like, what about teachers' psychological well-being? What about teachers' depression, teacher stress, which could be a big basis of classroom climate? And I found that there was only one study and there was no policy at all about teachers and workforce in early childhood education. So that's when I started to be fascinated by this policy work, because as I do more research in this area and as I build more research evidence in this area, we actually naturally get attention from policymakers and people start to recognize the importance of this work. So now I feel like whenever I go to conferences, there was actually no session about early childhood workforce development, or when I was speaking about well-being 10, 15 years ago, there wasn't that much interest. But at this point, like people recognize the importance of it and people start to build new policy ideas around workforce development in early care and education. So that's the reason why I'm motivated to this work and why I'm really interested in making a bigger impact by creating a new culture in research and like basically creating new topic area in early childhood education as well.
Thank you. And Dr. Nichols?
Yeah, there's some overlap here. I can date myself and start in the mid-90s as well, so you don't feel alone. But I got my PhD in a very traditional ed psych program and had no experience with policy, no classes, didn't even use the word really that I remember anyway, just a while ago. You know, and my dissertation was on motivation. That was the area I spent all my time thinking about, was the psychological underpinnings of motivation. And it wasn't until my postdoc with David Berliner, which did lead to the book that was referenced in the bio, that's a little dated now, but honestly, it's such an important crossroads in my career, because during that postdoc, working with my advisors at the time, I was exposed to the study of a policy. I spent an entire year thinking about No Child Left Behind, which had just passed. And I didn't really understand the relevance to ed psych. I felt like I was in a whole different arena. But that sort of was the ignition to what has become the driving force of what I'm trying to do for the work I do, but really more broadly for the field, which is to encourage more scholars to do, well, what both of our presenters talked about, but Dorothy specifically was saying, you know, I do everything starting from policy. To me, the research we do, you know, has so much potential for impact. And when in the initial years after the book and as No Child Left Behind was ramping up, I noticed there was very little research from educational psychologists weighing in on what this policy was doing in the classroom. You know, we saw more sort of policy lens analyses, trend data, you know, large scale sort of data on, you know, various outcomes such as graduation rates or retention rates, which is all important. But educational psychologists can go drill down and understand the underpinnings of what's actually going on in the relationships and the teaching and the back and forth in the classrooms and the school settings. And it's taken me years, and I'm still sort of developing sort of an idea of how what this intersection looks like, such that more people feel invited to take their educational psychology knowledge, skills, and expertise and look at policy as the avenue for its application and its real world potential for impact. So I stumbled into it. It's kind of grown over the course of my career as an organizing way to look at the utility of educational psychology.
Thank you. And you've all started to touch on this a little bit, but I think we want to mine a little more deeply into your process as you carry out your work. You know, so what is your process, kind of more specifically or explicitly, that you engage in to do this type of research? In other words, do you begin your study kind of as usual and then seek out policies that might relate to your phenomenon of interest? Do you begin with an educational policy and then consider what educational phenomena the policy might impact, both at the same time or some other process?
Well, I would say all. It depends. I think depends where the research is, right? So I'll use the bullying prevention then as example. We really had to build that literature that I did at Illinois in the ed psych department there, where we had a good both mixed methods, quantitative, qualitative base, so that we could say something about that policy, right? So, but now when I'm doing my, say, comp sex ed, moving topics a little bit, we start with policy or the lack of policy. And then we bring, as Sharon said, we bring the research to bear on that we now know that, and then add the climate and culture now of the reverse of Roe versus Wade. We knew that comp sex ed policies reduce sexual assault, reduce risky sexual behaviors, and unwanted pregnancy, yet we know that only 11 states have comp sex ed on the books, right? So we start with that policy, build the ed research to then, now we're ramping up to say, okay, how is it that we can get this research base to those policymakers so that we can support comp sex ed, for example. The other, which is consuming a lot of my summer, is trying to take the research in ed psych and other spaces that to legislators in some states that are adopting the Florida don't say gay bill, right? But also taking the ed research that we know that kids that are gender and sexual minority youth come out to teachers. And if you are telling teachers that they cannot discuss this when they come out with them, and that's a policy that many states are starting to adopt, ed research can say that that is going to be extremely problematic for the relationship for the teacher and the student, which we know is critical for academic and social emotional success. So, and then if it's a newer area, then we start building that research base and then we go from there. So I think it would depend on the research question and the avenue.
And I completely agree that it really depends. I would say when I first began this work, I had no idea how to do policy work. And I thought that it is important to build some evidence in the literature around teachers' well-being. So I was mostly doing a study as usual and then try to make policy implications or try to disseminate my findings to the policy related stakeholders. So that was kind of like beginning of my work, but as I do this work more in this field, I realized that it is important to think about policy implications from the beginning, because that may impact your research design. They may impact like which direction I want to go. And as I build more network or build trust with policymakers as well, I think it's becoming more bi-directional rather than like one way around. So I try to hear from policymakers what the gap might be and try to infuse the ideas in my research as well. So as an example, in Baltimore Education Research Consortium, as a researcher, I had a broad idea that in early childhood, there's no single data system across different disciplines. So health department, early Head Start, or public school, like all single data set. So we never know like what children's and families' experiences are from birth to 5 because all the data systems are all separate. So as a researcher and as the team in Baltimore Education Research Consortium, we had an idea of integrating this data set. So the work we do in Early Childhood Data Collaborative is that we partner with these local policymakers or local practitioners to integrate the data. So we do the data integration work, but we actually ask them to come up with different research questions. And we ask them, what's your interest? What kind of outcomes do you want us to look at? So we really interact and try to do this as like bi-directional research.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You know, the answer is definitely it depends. But I've been sitting here thinking about sort of my path, but then also what's good information to give others in terms of how you all think about it. I'm probably a big disappointment in some ways to my advisors, because if I were to go down the path I was trained to go down, I probably should be doing varying versions of work looking at student belonging and understanding the psychological mechanisms of belonging, because that's kind of where I started and that really interested me. And I was trying to understand, you know, in a brand new school, how do students come to learn to belong and what do teachers need to do? And there's a lot of things that could have been looked at there. But when I diverted to looking at No Child Left Behind, which I didn't, was a brand new experience to me, honestly, ever since then, I can only think in policy. I can't think in the psychology of motivation only. I have to ground all my thinking in the policy related question, even if it's what's the teacher's policy in the classroom, what's the policy of the curriculum in the state. Like the lens of the policy can be all over the place. But to me, the first question, and I think both of the other panelists said this, is kind of start with what is the policy implication. And I kind of take it for granted that's what everyone does. And I'm like, oh, I don't think everyone necessarily does that. And I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm just saying that understanding what the impact is of looking at this particular research question is fundamental to me even wanting to look at that research question. And I'm a little different. If you look at my Vita, my research is a little bit all over the place. I've looked at pre-service teachers' beliefs on various aspects of their career and their development. I've looked at identity and emotion. I've looked at certainly test-based stuff in a variety of ways, currently looking at, I think we're going to get to that question. We'll get into what I'm doing right now. But so I'm a little all over the place, but that's because I really only get attracted to what's the policy thing here. And I just figure I can bring my ed psych expertise, even if it's not the area I'm a total expert in, I know where to go. But the other piece that plays into how do you do this has to do with sort of where you are in your career, I think, as well. If you're brand new starting out, I think that the advice, look at the policy first, can be really helpful, because you're sort of grounding the start of the kinds of questions you want to ask in sort of the policy realm that you care about. For some folks who are farther along, maybe have always done more, I do memory, or I do something very psychological, not necessarily contextual. There's a different, it's searching for what are the policy implications once we've looked at this question. So it sort of depends where you are in your trajectory and the kind of scholarly identity you want, or you want to change to, or you want to have, that sort of tells us when and where to look at policy in your choices, I guess. So,
what are your suggestions for ensuring your work has concrete or actionable implications and outcomes?
I'll just start while the others are thinking. If I heard the question right, so maybe I overthought it, but make your implications explicit, first of all. Make it very explicit. If you look at a lot of ed's traditional, it's like papers in JEP and EP. EP is a little different, of course. There's not always a dedicated look at what are the implications to policy and to practice. And if there is, it's like a couple sentences, right? It's like this add-on. So first, make it explicit in your thinking and even in your writing. So that's one way to sort of get it out there. And I'll stop there and let others kind of weigh in and think some more, but that's a starting point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say that it's really great to think about. We kind of touched this already, but it's great to think about policy implications at the beginning of your research planning stage, so that I think it's kind of consistent with what Sharon said, like making it very explicit so that you can think about your research based on what kind of policy implications you might be able to make. And another advice I may give is, when you think about the writing process, sometimes academic publications or journals might not be popular for policymakers. So I'm thinking about recent publication that I had in Baltimore Education Research Consortium. We published Kindergarten Success Factbook, which has all the data around kindergarten outcomes and children's and families' experiences from birth to 5. So we had like 3 different files here. So one was a big data table, like multiple pages of PDF with all the data tables that researchers can use. And then we had 30 something pages of narrative, which explained those data table. And then we had an idea that we really need to come up with solid 2-pager, which can make implications for policy, and then policymakers can read easily. So I think making everything easily digestible is important as well. I always like the word knowledge broker as a researcher. So really between researcher and policymaker, I think you can become knowledge broker by doing more of like easily digestible writing as well.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I've got a lot of thoughts going on in my mind. I'm writing a lot of letters for nominations for the National Academy of Education. And as few of them are educational psychologists, and some of them are clearly explicate their policy implication, others not as well. But it's my job to do that. And it's my job also to get the general education research folks at the Academy to understand that educational psychology is still education research. Right. And so I think when I think about what you both said, that sometimes we have to do a better job of training our students and reminding ourselves that what about 100% of ed psych research has policy implications for ed research, right? But I think we forget that because the general education research folks see psychology and somehow they're dismissive of that, even if it's just the processes, right? And there's not one educational psychologist that looks like the other. So I think the other thing that I just had this aha moment with my students is that they often feel like that policy or practice implications section is something they just kind of have to do, like that limitation section that we do. And then they really, I say, no, go back to your last paper. And you've already said your next study, right? You've said, you know, how you've told the field and you've told policymakers through these outlets and through the congressional briefings that we do and the one-pagers and whatever we do. But I think that we get so kind of caught up like this publication's done, I've done the page proof, let's move on to the next thing, when in fact, we are already set out what is the next research question, what is the gap in understanding and extending that policy implication. So I know that's all over the place, but that's what happens when you're sitting here trying to convince ed researchers that ed psychologists have a value in the academy. And so it's seminars and webinars like this that are going to help early career and graduate students think about this such that you're not stumbling upon it or educating yourself. I would be hard pressed to think about even basic ed psych research that say Jeff Green does here in Chapel Hill, how there's not a policy implication based on the work that he does.
Thank you so much. And going from what you were just sharing, we're wondering about the experience in the office with the policymaker themselves, right? Like, you know, could you all share an experience where you maybe brought your work to a policymaker? Can you then share what that experience was like? And what is your advice for us for engaging with policymakers themselves, kind of in that one-on-one interaction?
Well, another thing that has consumed my summer is gun violence, and been working very hard to get policymakers to pay attention this time, and they did. So it's a win after 30 some years. Probably didn't go as far as we wanted it to go. But there were compromise, right? So, and I like how you said, you got to find out what are they focused on, right? Are they focused on gun violence? Are they focused on early child education, which they are, what a great field to be in. And so meeting them, compromising, seeing where you fit into their agenda. The other thing is understanding the political climate that you're entering into. Whose office are you walking into? What is their background? What are the problematic scenarios that you may encounter? And one very simple one is social emotional learning. If you're in a Republican's office, a policymaker or staffer, you say workforce development, or you say executive function. You don't say SEL. SEL is under attack now. And so just knowing who you're talking to, and although you might be this social justice warrior for, you know, comp ed or social emotional learning for teachers, that's not always well received. So understanding your audience.
So I completely agree, because what I realized by entering this policy field is that it takes time. It takes time to build partnership, and it takes time to understand the political climate. And sometimes taking this time, it might not necessarily lead to the products that are more counted towards academia, such as publications. But always, my advice would be, it is important to think about big picture and how you can you can move your research out there so that you can engage policymakers, so that you can help them set priorities as well. So, like from my experience, I think it is really a long journey to convince policymakers to pay attention and set as a priority. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, and I've worked on impact in little less direct ways, op-eds, written just a couple, try to, put out their information, and op-eds. But through doing that, and also the work on high stakes testing was disseminated various ways I won't necessarily go into that. So that gave me hope that there was some impact. Met with a few local legislators, but we were all on the same side of things. So I wasn't really personally challenged, walking into a Republican's office, having to convince them of something. I think that's a different thing. But through the efforts I've made connections with school boards, and that's sort of the area that I'm trying to make more greater inroads in here. Done some trainings, things like on helping school board members try to understand data, so they even just know how to make decisions or think about data. And it's like this whole, I'm discovering things as I go. Oh yeah, like that's actually probably a good thing to try to work on. Like, yeah, who are school board members and what do they know and what is their power? And so that's an area that I'm, starting to tread in a little more. But there's all kinds of ways to make impact. I mean, and to get your work out there. But I also agree it can be very time consuming. So this is can be seen as a bigger hill to climb, certainly for early career folks. And I can say that Avi Kaplan, who's the current president of Division 15, we've had lots of conversations about this and trying to also move the boat, if you will, on promotion and tenure that sort of helps to embrace this kind of work, to have a trickle down effect that incentivizes the work that we're talking about, which the work is the work, but getting it out there is this whole other piece that can be also hard, if not, take longer. So there's a lot of pieces that have to move, but slowly and bit by bit, I think you can find ways to get it out there, make an impact, get the information out there. And the policy briefs is another way to do that as well, or practice briefs. Yeah.
And final question for the panel from us before getting to attendees' questions is, what general advice might you have for researchers aspiring to do this type of work?
I would say, don't wait. If you're interested in policy, don't wait until people discover your work and approach you. I think you can be a little more proactive, and because it takes time to build trust, partnership, and it takes time to understand the climate where you're going into. So I think being proactive would be an advice that I give.
I would add, if you're a student, take a policy class, take an ed policy class, find one, convince your advisor it's important, it's going to be useful. Something that I wish that I had some more of, so I would do that.
One thing that, again, I just kind of figured out, no training, I was able to identify nonprofits and other folks that are on the Hill that have the capacity to get your research to policymakers. They can be a bridge, because oftentimes these nonprofits, like take Castle, for example. Castle's big, the Consortium of Academic Social Emotional Learning. They have an entire department that's just paying attention to what's happening on the Hill and what legislations. Get your research to them, and that's really leveraging, follow these people in your area, whoever they may be, whatever topic, and use social media to disseminate your publications, and have just what is the take-home message. So yes, you can get the link to the publication, but really, what do you want this particular nonprofit or educational group to know about your findings?
And let me just, if I can, do a quick plug of the new journal that is still in the making. We're hopefully it's coming. We're working on getting a publisher at this point. But there will be a session at the virtual APA where you'll get to talk to myself and Francesca Lopez, the inaugural editors, where we'll talk more about the journal. But part of the model of the journal will be for folks who publish in there. Will also be asked to do briefs. So there's going to be programs that help with the pipeline of this work from start to dissemination. So keep an eye out on that as well.
Thank you all to our panelists. And we already have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll start there. I'm just going to read them. The first is, on the one hand, there seems to be an expanding awareness of the importance of educational psychology and on whole child type thinking. On the other hand, phrases like socio-emotional learning are being demonized in some institutions and communities and media. How big of a threat do you see this as? And in your work, have you personally had to confront misunderstandings and fears of whole child thinking?
Yeah, I have and I think I spoke to that. So this is not really new. Social emotional learning was under attack prior to the current kind of milieu about it. So we knew, again, you just, depending on who you were talking to, you knew how to present it. It has heightened in the demonization, but it's also been challenged by not just focus on the family and others that see it as brainwashing of children, but there's also been academics that are calling it into question of whether or not it is an approach that has been built and consider black and brown children. The way that we are combating that demonization right now is we just got funded to do a large scale meta-analysis to see if social emotional learning programs actually are effective with black and brown children. So we answered their question and their suspect with research data. So stay tuned to that.
We'll go on to the next question. How can we ensure a better implementation of well-defined educational policy research in reality? Because it's a level to collect findings and it's another to implement the research for impact.
I think I was just going to say, celebrate small wins, celebrate, doing, quote unquote, doing what's right, putting out there what's right, good science and so forth. We have to find ways to feel good about that. And hope that, like with the gun situation and there, there's some large scale, finally progress, but look what it took and what it's still taking. And look even how little the bars moved. I mean, in the world that I've been in for most of my career, which is high stakes standardized testing, I mean, so many people have been fighting against it for so long and we still hold on to it. So it's, there's many things, especially when you start getting to people's worldviews and that they embrace like religion. It is hard to see change. It's hard to stay with it. So I have to constantly remind myself small wins are important and also local. Like this is where it's useful to stay local with things and get to know people, and relationship building, I think, can help. Because if you can make small change locally, that has potential to help with other types of change.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it takes time, right? So I sometimes talk with graduate students and like our dream is here, but like taking to that, it takes forever. But actually when you do the work, and I completely agree that like celebrating a small win is a great strategy, because when I look back for 15 years, actually we made a lot of progress, but at that point when you're making that, you don't see that progress. So I think like just taking time and build partnership and build trust is important.
Yeah, I would add, I don't know, I've just been thinking a lot about our field, but I think that in the 3 universities I've been at, ed policy researchers are rarely well respected. Ed policy researchers are doing some really impressive large data systems work, right? And so, but we're not all trained as ed policy researchers. So we've dabbled and we train ourselves. So I think we may have to think about training the next generation of educational researchers where ed policy is a class, not just a class, but an ideology or something that needs to be part of their toolkit, to say one. 2, we need to have more examples of like WT Grant that was funding, study the research of how policymakers use our research, right? So then you flip that research question upside down. And then increasingly I'm seeing that people are going off on their own and creating these kind of shops where they take our research and they connect us with policymakers, and it's research policy to practice kind of consortiums that are coming together. I don't know how they do that, but I think that making sure it's just not an add-on, but integrating into the training of those that are going to go on as we retire.
Yeah, and I just want to say to remember that policy is connected to practice. So another area that it's like historically there's been ongoing tension over being relevant to practice. And we've seen a lot of movement with community engaged scholarship and more embrace of diversity of methods and attention to context. We keep talking about policy as its own thing, but I don't see it separate from practice. You change policy, you change practice. It is what practice is dictated from. Teachers have to make all kinds of decisions based on whatever the parameters are in which they operate. So the policy largely dictates that, sometimes in very big ways, like don't say gay, or, you know, these very strident ways. And sometimes it's subtle, like have a discipline policy that has these elements. So another place to anchor yourself and to see the potential for impact is to understand how these things go together and how important that is to what the science can offer.
Thank you. It looks like we have another question in the chat, and that is, can you please speak about the rapport and trust building process when doing research with communities to then hopefully inform and change policy?
For me, I actually started to do this work in Baltimore when I first became faculty member at Johns Hopkins, and I just attended meetings. I just tried to find which groups there are related to early childhood, like not just policymakers, like advocates, practitioners, families, teachers. There are multiple groups in Baltimore, so I just tried to attend those meetings and try to contribute to those meetings whenever there's any opportunity. Then people started to see me as an insider at certain points. Then people start to come and talk. And I think that point I was able to think about bigger impact in the city and then larger at the state level too.
Okay. Well, thank you to the attendees for your questions. And thank you again to the panelists for your wisdom and guidance. We greatly appreciate your time.